We have joining us Enrique Silva, who is the Director of International Initiatives here at the Lincoln Institute, Erwin van der Krabben, who is at Radboud University in the Netherlands, and joining us remotely in a moment will be Lourdes German. Good morning, Lourdes. She is. Good morning. She is Executive Director of the Public Finance Initiative. The links to all this is, by the way, is in the agenda that you can access in the QR code. She is also at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Moderating today's session is Meghan Stromberg, editor of Planning Magazine, and so glad that you could come here from Chicago. And you have this task before you now. I will turn it over to you now.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. Good morning. Oh, I gotta wake this back up. So today we're going to do a little bit of a switch in scale. Yesterday we covered a lot of ground and we talked about a lot of issues at a macro scale. So as Anthony just mentioned, we talked about the competition for land, particularly when it comes to agricultural land and the difficulty of already large and growing population that needs to be fed. And sort of this competition, what we learned needs to also happen at the same time is we need to take some of that land out of use for agricultural production and put it to another use. Some of that use is the land actually doing the amazing work that it always does in terms of accumulating carbon and healing the planet and really just letting it be to do that work. We also talked about trees and forests and some of the amazing work that they do and that the land does with their help, that they're, particularly these large tracts of naturally biodiverse old forests that not just function to accumulate carbon, but to actually work together and support one another. That's another way, and then to send that carbon down into earth. That's another way that the land does work for us. And again, those are really macro level ideas and sort of large pieces of land and occasionally on a really a global scale, the changes that we're facing, they need to be made. And we're gonna talk today about how land can work on a more micro scale, down to specific pieces of land, particularly in urban environments. And actually, the first presentation of the morning yesterday from Brian Golden at the Boston Planning and Development Agency really sets the scene for that. We learned from him and his colleagues about their so far pretty successful efforts to layer plans and policies and incentives to create a strategy that has eventually led them to be able to get developers to help pay for resiliency. And they're doing that by letting the land sort of do that work for them. And our panelists today are going to tell us a little bit more about how land can work in that way, how it can help to actually fund the climate resiliency that we all need, particularly through a financial tool called land value capture. So why don't we, So can land do this work? Yeah, it can. The simple answer is yes, but of course it's a lot more complicated than that. And so we're going to learn a little bit about, Lourdes is going to tell us about some of the financial complications. We're going to hear about some examples where this is taking place, and we're also going to talk about the challenge of making sure that we're doing this equitably, because of course it's the high value land that produces this this high value land that produces the opportunity to do this financial piece, this financial layering, and yet, that's not the land where the least among us live. Their land is not producing a lot of that actual financial value, and we need to make sure that they're accruing the benefits. So first, let's get started by learning sort of what land value capture is. And Enrique, can you sort of give us a sense of what it is and how it can be used to finance some of the resiliency efforts that we need to put in place?
Sure thing. Thank you, Megan, and good morning, everyone. Just puts a smile on my face when I say I get to talk about land value capture, and there we go. I want to take just a slight step back and repeat a couple of things, or emphasize a couple of things that were that we started hearing from the second Mac opened up the session. At the Institute, one of the things that we've been arguing for and studying very carefully is what role local governments and localities can do for climate adaptation. And one of the arguments or points that we've been looking at within that, and it's something that we've been talking about especially since we participated pretty heavily in the Habitat 3, was that housing, poverty, climate change, if we don't have fiscally stable or fiscally healthy municipalities, the role of the municipality or the role of the local government really is undermined or not helped. And within that, as Mac was saying, that what municipalities have, they sit on a massive asset, and that's land. But land is a relatively underused source of revenue and a leverage for those municipal governments. One way to look at it is when it comes to land, municipalities, essentially for the most part, many places don't use it, and by not using it, it's the equivalent of leaving money on the table, and we can talk about that later. But let me take a step back, because in order to understand land value capture, we need to have the basics of land values. Land acquires value, and sorry for being very 101 here with you, but land acquires value when it can meet a demand for its use. So land doesn't have any value unless someone wants it for housing, for services, for production, and so forth. Leisure, any of that. So it's the demand on land that gives it its value. When government invests, doesn't spend, when it invests, just as we were talking about, invests in the infrastructure or in the things that make land useful for those demands, when it actually helps regulate and says what can or can't be done and how intensely land can be used, those actions, investments on infrastructure, water, utilities, those regulations, how densely it can be used, all of that generates value on the property. Now, when we're in regimes where most of the land is privately owned, but government is making those investments and is regulating the use, government is directly contributing to the increase in the property value of that lot or those lots. And so here, there's a pretty quick, immediate dictum that we have. Land values are conditioned by governmental regulations and investment. And the important point, and this is where land value capture comes in, that those land value increments, especially on private property, can be captured. Some would argue should be captured to anticipate or recuperate public investments and supplement public revenues. We're not talking about, if you look at the gap that we need to finance climate change, and we're in the 16 trillions, if you go to the Earth counts, it's this ongoing loop. Land value capture is not going to solve that, but it's an important missing link, especially for those of us that are focused on planning issues at the local level. So those values can be captured, and that's where the concept of value capture comes in. Land value capture is a policy concept or approach and a set of tools. It's one term that covers many things. One could argue it's also a philosophy that enables communities to recover and reinvest those land value increments that result from public investment and government actions on private property. So it's that increment that can be linked to the investments or the regulations that governments are doing, and doing it on behalf of the public. Now, that might sound abstract, so I'm going to kind of give you a sense of some of the tools that would fall under value capture. Value capture tool is an impact fee. Some of you who cover urban beats might have heard those. Special assessments or betterment contributions. In other places, in particular in Latin America, something that we've been covering a lot is how Latin American cities use charges on building rights or certificates of additional construction potential. Also, if some of you have colleagues or you cover housing, inclusionary housing is considered a land value capture tool. And then another form of land value capture tool, and we can get into the weeds on this, is the property tax. To the extent that the property tax is tracking the value, the increases in the land value, not just the building or the property that's on that asset. So might sound simple or might sound so great, or if maybe somebody is like, this is the holy grail of money, it's the gold pot at the end of. It sounds simple, it's a basic concept. Unfortunately, and this is what keeps us somewhat in business, it's not very well used, or it's not used to the extent that it could be used. Some places do it better, others don't, but overall, it's an underutilized resource. As I was mentioning, most municipalities don't even kind of link the relationship between their actions and the investments and the increases that they contribute to private property. And so there are at least 4 basic challenges, and I attribute this to my colleague Martin Smolka. He's come up with the 3 I's to understand the challenges to land value capture, and I'm going to add a 4th I. The first challenge or barrier to implementing land value capture, or this concept that I'm talking about, is ignorance. People in local communities, planners, and agencies don't really know that that's a tool, or they or don't understand the relationship between their investments and actions and what triggers or drives land values. Very basic one. And we were just talking as planners, and if you could avoid the land markets class in planning school, if they offered it, we did. So planners don't know, for the most part, they're not well read, or they haven't internalized that dynamic component of it. We do all the planning, we do the zoning, we say where the investments should go, but we're not necessarily thinking about the link of those ideas and visions to the funding source or how it could fund those very same ideas. The other I is ideology. Land value capture is contentious in part because there's a fight, and we were talking about this from Mac's very first comments, who owns the individual right to property? And in this case, who owns the value of property? What component of it? Mm-hmm. What are the limitations on private property for that? And do they keep that money? Do they keep that value? The other is, as we heard before, inertia as well. In places where you haven't been using land value capture, introducing the idea that the government has to articulate and then implement a tool that says there's a part of your property value that it doesn't belong to you, we have to retract it, I need to bring that back. Think about doing that. Setting that up, just setting that up bureaucratically, the challenge, so there's an inertia. And this is the 4th I that I'm adding, and I might actually be shooting myself in the foot, and it might not even be a word, illegibility. Illegible. So the value capture tools, and even describing it or writing it down is really difficult, and it's difficult to read and interpret. Another thing that is illegible, and I'm really forcing that I there, is how do we calculate and identify that increment that is linked to the action? Because not all of the property value in a private is totally linked. We're just arguing about the property value that is linked to those investments and actions being made on land. So, and that's something that's very important. That's something that we've invested a lot of time and energy here at the Institute, is valuation. What is the real value, or what's driving the value? And then how do we separate the source of or the trigger for that value? So keep an eye on our work on that as well, because it's linked, and it's linked to many other issues that we won't have time to talk about. Despite those 4 challenges, there are wonderful cases in the United States and across the world, in particular where we've been working on in Latin America, for reasons to advocate for and reasons to kind of push the implementation of some of these tools. And the first one is there's a very pragmatic reason to do it. If you need money, and especially if you're in a no more taxes place, land value capture is not a form of taxation, it's a recovery of investment. And you have a newfound source of revenue, or you could have that newfound source. And again, there are tools that allow you to capture those revenues and bring them into public coffers for reinvestments or whatnot. And then there's an equity argument for land value capture. And that is, who bears the costs of how do you share equitably the benefits and burdens of urbanization and urban development? Density. We need density. We need to put people in places. We're increasingly verticalizing, going up. That benefits the property owner that has the piece of land that allows to have a skyscraper. Think of the Pencil Towers in New York City. Tiny little piece of land multiplied by 100 going up. That's a benefit to someone. Yet that same tower or those towers create a burden on the surface, on the street, on traffic, on the public realm. How do you best equalize those benefits and burdens? And land value capture, we can get into that a bit more in the cases, but land value capture proposes a way to equalize that. And then it could be efficient if applied well and if you get rid of the eligibility component of it. There are relatively easy ways to recover the cost either upfront or over a period of time to get that stream of revenue coming in. So what we want to do today, though, specifically, is once we have this concept that you have this concept and tool of land value capture that's predicated first on an action that creates value on private property, how can we use it for climate change? So the question that we're grappling with and that we'll see now with Erwin's work is, what are those actions that governments are taking that are driven by an agenda for climate change and adaptation that are generating or could generate windfalls for private property owners? And if that's happening, what are our opportunities? What might be our responsibility to recover some of that to continue funding the climate agenda or other agendas that we might have at the local or even state or regional level? That's my 101.
I thought that's a pretty good 101, actually. And so what Enrique is basically saying is that land, and particularly in urban environments, doesn't exist in a vacuum, of course, and its value is defined by the regulations, of course, that apply to it, but also by the various investments that also apply to it, and including civic investment, and including, again, but going back to the Boston example, including the civic investment in climate infrastructure, protective climate resilience infrastructure. And Erwin's going to talk a little bit about that, and I wonder, can you tell us how climate action, like building in this infrastructural resilience, resilience to climate impacts, in fact impacts the value of land?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Let me first confirm that I agree with everything that Enrique said. Also that actually it's the whole issue of land value and land value capture is, you might say, sounds pretty simple and straightforward. I'm still appointed 12 years ago as a professor in land policy or land value capture. I remember very well at that time my son was only 12 years old then, and he said, "So Dad, you can even become a professor in a topic like that." And I did. He's in science now and much smarter than I am. My research, and then that refers also to Meghan's question, actually is structured around three main questions. And can you put on my slides? And it starts, already mentioned by Enrique. First question actually is how much value there is in land. And that's something we need to know when we start to talk about land value capture, when we start to talk about or to think about how to capture that land value. We need to answer that first question, how much value there is on land. And this is an example from my own country, from the Netherlands. So imagine agricultural land, the value of that agricultural land per acre, $20,000. When the government decides to change the land use into residential, puts in infrastructure and services that land, then the value of that same plot of land increases to around $6 million per acre. It's quite an extreme case. My country is a very densely populated country. Land is scarce. But it might even further increase if we increase the FAR for that plot. We start building apartment blocks, then it will further increase. So there's quite a lot of value in land. A fundamental question, a political, legal question is, economic question is, to whom belongs that value? Does it belong to the landowner? But the landowner didn't have to do anything for that enormous increment, that uplift in value of his land or her land. So then the alternative would be then it belongs to society. And that's what land value capture is about, to capture part of that uplift in land value. That also refers to what Meg was referring to yesterday with the tax, the land increment value tax in Taiwan, where they tax about 40 to 60%, if I remember well, from that increment land value. They capture that by a tax. But in many countries, it's impossible to do that. There's no legislation for that. In many countries, I think, around the world, there's ignorance related to one of your eyes on how much actually that increment value is. Second question is on what is the impact, what can be the impact of particular policies, public investments on land values. And this slide refers to our Breathable Cities project, sponsored by the Lincoln Institute. I'm working on that with colleagues from the UK and China. And what we do in this project is to provide evidence of what is the impact of reducing air pollution. Air pollution is a big issue, a big problem in many Chinese cities. So in terms of environmental policies, there's many policies to reduce air pollution, to provide clean air. So what we did is, this is data for city Zhengzhou, probably never heard of it, but it's a city with population of more than 10 million people. And we collected data on property prices, and we collected data on air pollution, and very localized air pollution in this city. And what we, I won't go into the details, but what we find is that yes, there is, as you perhaps can imagine, there's a negative impact of air pollution on property prices. People don't want to live in areas where there's so much air pollution. And when there's a negative impact on property prices, there's a negative impact on land value as well, because the value of land depends on what you build on it and on what the value is of what you built on it. So bringing all the data together, what we found here is that there's a significant impact of air pollution on property prices in this city, and we did this for all the cities as well in China. And we can claim that if air pollution would be reduced with 10%, that leads to an increase in land values of 5%, which is quite substantial. And in the context of China, where land is state-owned, it's actually also, you might say, it's accessible for the government, for local government. What they do, they lease land, and they get an income from quite huge income from leasing that land. If they would invest, if we can convince them to invest in clean air by building wind turbines, for instance, that building those wind turbines leads to an increase in property values, an increase in land value, an increase in revenues from leasing out that land for the local government. And you can, if you think in the terms of a virtual value cycle, so if you use those revenues again for investing in more wind turbines with even more clean air, then there's a cycle. There's a virtuous cycle. So that's that's actually our next and our last step in this research. We're able to calculate, well, we have the numbers. What we're doing now, or what we try to do now, is to at least to start a discussion with people in local government to see if this makes sense to them, if they would be willing to think along this virtuous value cycle. And that has to do with awareness, of course. Now, third question is, and that again relates to what Enrique was already saying, is what if we know this about this relation and about this impact, then what kind of policies and land value capture instruments are there, and how can they be used effectively? And that relates actually to another project we just started with the Lincoln Institute, where I'm working with a colleague from the UK and here from the US, where we do a comparative study of land-based finance for climate adaptation, urban climate adaptation projects in Dutch cities, British cities, and American cities. And that has to do, or what we try to focus on in these projects is actually the willingness of developers to contribute. That relates to the talk we had yesterday about Boston from Brian Golden, who explained that yes, apparently private developers in this city are willing to contribute. If you remember, I asked him the question, but then do they contribute enough? And that relates to my first question. You need to know actually how much, what is or the first and second question, what is the increase in value because of these investments in climate adaptation? If you have that information, then you can create awareness, and then you are in a better position to, of course, to negotiate developer contributions to that. In Dutch cities, it's already pretty standardized that we include public climate adaptation infrastructure in the goals where we want developers to contribute. That works quite well, and I have more examples, but perhaps for later. That works quite well when these investments are, let's say, on-site infrastructure. So then it has a direct impact. And what I mean with on-site infrastructure is that in the location where that private developer is going to develop, is going to make his investments, if we make that a climate-proof location, then there's a direct impact, and developers will understand there's a direct impact of public investments in climate proofing on property value. So they're willing to contribute. When we try to think in a bit broader context, so not all of these climate proofing investments will be on the location itself, but will be in other parts of the city and will be more indirect. But we still, as society, we benefit from all these investments. And if society benefits, we can translate that in property values, and we can translate that in land value. But then it becomes more difficult to convince private developers. We do that, or cities, Dutch cities do that. They convince them, but they can charge. They have the authority to require investments from private developers in wind turbine parks outside of the city that have no direct impact on their location itself, but we still want them to invest in that. That works well, and there's awareness, there's institutional capacity in Dutch cities. Land policy they've been working with that for decades. But then move to another project we're working on in Indonesia. And we're working on, as some of you may know, in Java, the big island in Indonesia, where the capital city is, Jakarta. North coast of Java, Jakarta, but also quite a few other cities are actually sinking into the soil because of land subsidence. Big problem. Problem is so big that the national government of Indonesia has decided to build a new capital on another island, actually. Has not so much land subsidence has not directly something to do with climate change. But there is an impact of climate change and sea level rise. I've been in places in those cities in Indonesia where every day when there's high tide, places are flooded. So there's not even a risk anymore. It's daily flooding in those places. And I've been standing in, that's the example I always use, be standing in a home a couple of years ago, people living in that home, they told me, well, actually the first house that was built on this spot, this location, has already sunk into the soil. Was built 25 years ago. Second house that was built on that spot had also sunk into the soil. And we were standing in the third house on top of these two. And they were still sinking. Now back to land value capture. There's technical solutions for that. There's technical solutions to stop the land subsidence. Because it's caused by extracting water from the soil. It's actually caused by, Indonesia used to be colonized by the Dutch, was implemented, that system, by the Dutch hundreds of years ago. So in part, we're responsible for that. There's technical solutions, but they cost money. And what we have been working on, I have a PhD candidate working on that, we show that what the impact of these technical, we first show what the impact is of land subsidence on land and real estate markets. And it's not difficult to understand that there's a negative impact. We have the data for that. But then, and that's comparing Indonesia with the Netherlands, then make a next step to convince both local governments and regional governments and private developers to work on this virtual value cycle, to start investing, to contributing to the cost of these technical solutions, because that will help that will create value, etc., as I explained. That's still a step too far right now. That's because there's institutional capacity problems, there's lack of awareness from both actually from the public and from the private sector. So then it still appears to be very difficult. So I'm stop here. When we think of solutions and implementing land value capture policies, you might say here in the global north, we have there's lots of opportunities and best practices how this may work. Go to the global south, then it becomes harder and much more difficult to do this. And there's still a lot of work to do.
Thank you. So as Enrique laid out, the idea of land value capture is actually kind of straightforward. Like once you get a sense of it, it's really makes a lot of sense. But as we're finding out, it's actually quite complicated, and a lot of it has to do with, in China, you've kind of a command and control. They can kind of do what they want in terms of what they do with land, what they do with taxation, et cetera. In other places, like the Netherlands, where it's already an established practice, then they've also had successes. But getting it established can be difficult. And Lourdes is going to tell us a little bit about how this particular financial mechanism works with others. One of the themes throughout this whole meeting has been that each of the things we've been talking about are part of the solution, but not the entire solution. So I wonder, Lourdes, if you could tell us how this kind of fits in with other climate finance tools and mechanisms.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the wonderful invitation to join this wonderful panel. So you hit the nail on the head on what I think is the most significant question that we need to ask to deal with what is the most significant challenge of our time, climate change. And Enrique mentioned in his remarks, 16 trillion, a really high number when we think, what is needed from the scale of capital to address this challenge. And in the US alone, there was a study by Yale a couple of weeks ago, I think, that just said 4.5 trillion is just the amount of investment in the US just to decarbonize our energy supply. Think about that. And the reason why it's important to think about land value capture in concert with other instruments is like, if you were baking a pie, would you bake a pie without the butter? That would be ignorant. That would be getting at one of Enrique's core eyes, right? It wouldn't work. It wouldn't be the same. You could get a result. And for municipal governments to come to the table, as I just heard Mac wisely suggested is necessary, or any government, you want to think about maximizing the resource base that you bring to this challenge. Value capture is an integral component in two different ways. If you think about how governments raise money on their own at the simplest level, taxes, charges, fines, fees, you cannot maximize that revenue source without value capture. You also do it with a greater intentionality towards equity, values of social justice. When you think about the fact that charges and fines and fees that are coming from a developer audience and not falling on people, as we see through many communities who are facing social justice challenges, is a good practice to maximize your own source revenue base. In addition to that, you've got investments, the money that comes from public-private partnerships, from bonds and other sources where there's a liability that's created on your balance sheet that's going to be paid in the future, and it's absolutely critical and just as important as revenues, right? And if value capture is not a component of that, you are not maximizing your revenue base. You are leaving money on the table. There are underutilized mechanisms for which you are not pulling a lever. And it's not just the sort of revenue maximization and resource maximization argument, but think about something that Erwin mentioned a little bit earlier on that I really want to underscore here. Whether we are talking about financing adaptation, projects that are adjusting to the current and future effects of climate change, or mitigation, making impacts of climate change less severe, right? By thinking about reducing our greenhouse emissions. Every single project is not going to have a one-on-one correlation to every single financing instrument you can do as a community or that we can find in government, even with something as broad in scope as the infrastructure bill that I understand we were discussing this morning with DOT executives. There's going to be not only a one-on-one correlation that you need to carefully examine as a government to say, can we finance that piece that we need, that we believe is the critical intervention, with impact fees or with a green bond or with a public-private partnership that's going to need to be answered. But in addition to that, and I think this is sort of the point that Erwin made that I want to underscore, every single project we've been talking about has a useful life. The useful life and stages of those projects are going to require different sources of capital that are going to be strategic, important, and better than others, if we're talking about them in a beginning stage, in the middle, or when they are placed in service and actually working. And strategic awareness over that is sort of, I think, kind of like where the pie analogy becomes important for me, because if you're not leveraging every component at the right time, in the right place, and in the right way, you are doing a disservice in government to meeting this challenge. You either might not raise sufficient funds, or you might not be using the funds strategically into their highest and best use. And one of the key things that kind of underscores why this is important is, particularly when we think, what are the leading innovations? Beyond financing things that we know could be tried and true, when we are taking a risk, when we are saying that we are developing a project at scale that has the potential to force us to think differently about approaching these issues, this is where it becomes important, because you need to not only have the resources, but also think, am I meeting the scale of the problem in a way that the public narrative and my devotion of resources to this versus other critical needs in a politically charged environment where climate change perhaps is not broadly accepted is going to be supported. And I'll raise one example of what I consider to be sort of a leading innovation, and we can certainly talk about others. It harkens to the conversation we've been having about China. So when we think about one of the most visceral and visible effects, right, and we think there's a failure there, it's you see a flood, and you see a flood happen time over time. You see deaths, you see, lack of managed retreat that is thoughtful, particularly with communities that are underserved. We know that, we can feel it, and it's hard to deny that. And the question is, what actions do you take before that, right? To think like, we could have done something 5 years ago. In China, with the sponge city concepts, offers an innovation that's not new, but really started in the 1990s, and we saw threads of it in other countries. But that really represents, in my eyes, and I know the Lincoln Institute has drafted a great piece about this in Landlines, particularly in Shenzhen, highlighting, the potential for this. I think there are 641 of over 650 large Chinese cities experienced urban flooding since 2012. Devastating effects that I don't need to mention to all of you, in which we've seen comparable effects in both Texas, Louisiana, and so many other places, not just in the US and abroad. And one of the key things that the Sponge Cities introduces is a different way to think about urban infrastructure, to really think about how cities can think about urban design, like green roofs, open green spaces, interconnected waterways, and other mechanisms that we would normally not put in the gray infrastructure category, to not only retain water, but actually filter it and think about the flow of water through a community differently and more strategically. And in my mind, when I think about an innovation like that, I think the cost of inaction is so high. How do we not do this? How do we not do this everywhere in the world? But it demands devotion of resources from government, as it did in China. That's not atypical. And one of the key questions that arises in a public narrative around a project like that, despite seeing its value, is saying, well, where's the cost recovery, right? It's not a project that produces revenues. How do I justify that narrative? It's just like a street light. Who wants to pay for that? And the charged environment around that could create a different discourse. So if we're not maximizing revenues and enabling communities to draw from multiple sources of funds, projects like that, would be inhibited. If we're not thinking about the value of investors coming to the table, projects like that couldn't be carried out at scale over time into the number of pilots that could grow to make them a mainstay. And that's one point that I want to think about when we say, what does it mean to think about finance holistically? Value capture is critical to that. And also thinking about it in concert with other elements to give projects like that and others the kind of sustained continuity and even kind of the chance to exist. And the one final point that I'll end on is when we think about the social justice piece, we also want to think about what is happening today that really creates a different way to look at the capital stack and think strategically about opportunities that won't be here for a long time. I think our infrastructure bill is a great example of that we could talk more and sort of the direction it leads towards certain types of climate financing that could be coupled and complemented with others.
Thank you. So what is, to any of you actually, so what is needed to sort of smooth the way at the national, state, or municipal or federal level to financing resilience using these tools? Like what are some of the things that are missing, and what are some of the things that we need to make sure we understand better in order to use these tools? Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, like everything, it's multi-pronged efforts. But one of the things that we've honed into, excuse me, is, and it comes up over and over again. One of the strings of lines of work that we have at the Institute are training and professional development courses for planners, for public officials, and so forth, mid-career. They're in high demand, and they're in high demand because they're offering this whole concept of land markets linked to planning, to other agendas, and so forth. And so they're the demand signaling. One, there's a demand, but it's also signaling at some point in the education of the people that are actually leading these efforts, they're not getting this. And so we do have to pay attention to how we're training the people that are on the front lines and the people that should be advocating from within, in this case, within municipal governments, about these things and the awareness. It goes to that ignorance. So the ignorance is it's overwhelming when you start unpacking it, but that's what we have education systems for. And so where do we leverage the introduction of these, and not so much the concepts and the ideas and the knowledge are out there, but they're in different parts of the ecology of learning. And what we're trying to do is at least target into the graduate programs for planners, relatively modest piece of the pie for actors, maybe, and we actually have, thanks to our colleague Laura, with journalists in Latin America, doing professional development courses on markets for journalists, just so they have this basic understanding. But we're also engaging with planning schools in Latin America, here in the United States, in Europe, on creating graduate programs in planning or graduate programs in land policy that integrate all of these things, so that the people go out with, depending on how you look at it, with a chip in their head already there, so that they're advocates. And I say this in part because we just finished a course showcasing the 30-year history of land value capture in Sao Paulo for an international audience. And we had a participant there from the city of Newton, which is a suburb just of Boston here. He's not in the city, but he works with the city. And he found out that I worked at the city years ago. He's like, how do I work with people to get value capture on the Newton agenda, just in my community? And he's like, I've been, I don't know anything. It's like, well, if you don't get this, like, I can't convince the counselors and so forth. It's like, you can go for the counselors, but if there's not someone in the planning department working with the counselors or pushing them to rethink how they're doing things, they're not going to do it. So then the question is, do they have the capacities to advocate for it? So that's just one sliver, and that goes back to curriculum and blending these things that we know into the way we teach those people that are out in the front lines, and apply that to different sectors and disciplines.
If I may add something to that. I think spatial planners now and then, and that would be helpful, they need to think as economists. Not all the time, now and then. Because with spatial planning has a big impact on the performance of land and real estate markets, as we explained with the impact of land use change on land value. But it's not a very transparent market, and it's also, in a way, when we consider a market for real estate development, it's not a very competitive market, you might say, because what we see in real estate development is the common strategy for private developers is they compete for land. They have land banking strategies. They buy land, and with their land banks, they have a position, they create a position, a quite powerful position with locational monopolies even. Because when you have land, you can build on it, and you have the power or you have the authority to build on it, depending on the land use plan. There's nobody else that can use that land anymore. So it's a one-on-one relation between local governments and these land-owning developers with their powerful positions to decide what to do on it. And still they have to negotiate, so it's not that easy. But in such a situation where there's no real competition, I would rather prefer, from an economic perspective, that there would be competition for that the best project can win and can be built. But that's not how it works. It's the developer owning the land that will always win that competition. There is no competition. So in such a situation, and that's where we have to deal with that, you need to be very transparent about about land ownership, about land prices, about what the government is going to do, about how much the government is charging these developers, about what the impact is of all these land use changes on property prices. And so that's the best thing I guess we can do, make it transparent, and then you can have a good discussion and a good negotiation between spatial planning and the development industry on how to build sustainable places and how to make those developers contribute to that.
Thank you. Lourdes, I'm going to let you get in on this, and then I think afterwards we should open up to the audience. So what are some things we can do to smooth the process?
Yeah, I'll add 2 points that we haven't talked about. So one is when you begin a project, especially resiliency, you want to make sure that there's sustained continuity to the revenue stream. One thing we have to acknowledge is that different value capture instruments will either be bringing a lot of one-time revenues versus recurring revenues. Like if we have a property tax, we can project year over year what we're going to collect, assuming that collections are strong and other elements that we're not going to dive into in this panel. If we have impact fees, for example, or developer exactions, we might lose the predictability of revenues. We might be looking at sort of one-time fees that come in which we model around the strength of our real estate or land markets and development and the climate of what's happening in the community. And we all know that there's so many things that can create dislocations as we just lived through COVID, which is changing so much of how we think of where we live and work and changing real estate markets in communities that otherwise never experienced the patterns that they're seeing now with different migration, even within the United States. The other piece is cost of capital. So if you are a government official, you are thinking prudently about what is it going to cost me in the end to do this project when I blend multiple sources of capital together at different stages. I think one benefit of value capture is that often because you are boosting own source revenues, because you're not really venturing with value capture into the investment space with minor exception, you've got a really strong argument there. So I think it's sort of like also counterbalancing those effects where we're dealing with public officials who really have awareness rather than kind of all of those nuances and what it means to fund a project with those considerations in mind.